in this process of people going through job interviews and networking conversations, what are the signals that turn the green light on, turn the red light flashing and blinking? What are those things that we should know about and look out for?
Most people would assume that the things that are going to build trust for a person are those very human moments. When you tell stories and, you're being a bit more vulnerable with a person. Interestingly enough, that wasn't the thing that built trust most effectively. But the things that really strengthened trust were these things. Number one, it was that you were dependable, which means that you could be relied on. Number two, it was that you were honest, which meant there was alignment between your words and your actions. Number three, you actively listened. So the way you listened in a conversation was ultimately building trust. You gave helpful feedback. We were modeling behaviors, or what they called leading by example, and that they genuinely cared about employee well-being, or we genuinely cared about people.
The idea of job security is outdated as a landline. If you haven't been in a search for a while, it's probable you will at some point, by choice or not. Most executives admit to staying way too long, or sense what's coming and justify staying anyway. Here, there's another reason. The faulty belief that navigating to what's next will inevitably be worse and has to suck. Screw that. Lauren Greif has spent a lifetime in corporate and executive search, calling bullshit on stale career advice that most still use. This is Career Blast in a Half, the career podcast for executives ready to cut past outdated career advice to fuel your outcomes now. So let's go.
All right. So I brought in a new voice, at least new to the US. And that doesn't mean he's a stranger, because our guest today, Sean Hatton, is an incredible leader. He's also the author of 2 incredible books, Lead the Room, Communicate a Message That Counts in Moments That Matter. We're going to get to that. And also Let's Talk Culture, the conversations you need to create the teams you want. And Shane, I am so honored to have you here. You are obviously an expert in culture, communication, and conversations that matter. And today we're going to take some of those conversations and we're going to point them in the direction of folks that may even need them more than ever, because when you are in your job search, it's hard to know who to trust, both from the hiring manager's perspective and, of course, from the candidate's perspective when they're hungry for that job, but also don't want to set themselves up for a culture that may not necessarily want to have those open conversations. So I just want to say, hey, thanks so much for being here and owning this topic.
Oh, it's such a privilege. I always love conversations. I think at the core of my human needs is good conversations with great people, and I feel like those boxes are going to get ticked in this conversation today. So thank you so much for having me.
We're going to keep it light and spicy. Yeah.
Great.
So I had the great opportunity of hearing some of the quotes that have become your hallmarks. And one of them that kept coming up over and over and over again was that in critical moments, people look for someone to lead them, not just inform them. And so I was curious about how our audience, folks who are in these tenuous, sometimes challenging periods of their interview process or even in their job search, how can they leverage this insight when they're also in a position of seeking an opportunity? So in those critical moments, how are they going beyond just informing? How are they leading?
It's a great question. Where that originally came from was this idea that when I started out my practice nearly 8 years ago, I was invited to speak to leaders in organizations and teams, essentially to help them feel more confident when they had to stand up in front of a room full of people and speak. And, we typically talked about presentation skills and public speaking. And the more I reflected on the really important moments in life, whether they're moments of uncertainty, challenge, transition, or change, I've found that we tend to look to leaders in those critical moments. And I don't mean leaders necessarily political leaders or organizational leaders. Sometimes it's just the leader within a friendship group, or maybe it's the leader within a household. So you look to a parental figure, and we've all had those moments where things have been challenging and we've called up a relative or a friend and gone, well, I just need your help or some advice right now. And I find that we tend to look to leadership figures for something. And I started to dig a little bit deeper and I said, well, what is it that we look for? And the answers were varied. Some people said they're looking for clarity, they're looking for empathy, they're looking for a sense of certainty, they're looking for someone to help them make sense of the situation. And we look to all these, to leaders for all these characteristics. And I says, as I started to summarize all the characteristics that we look for in leaders, not one person said they're looking for a leader that just knows how to put a good slide deck together. They're not looking for someone who knows how to appropriately use hand gestures or knows how to project their voice. All the characteristics that people were looking for in those critical moments were leadership characteristics. So whether you have the title of leader or whether you have the influence of leader, we all have the opportunity to be able to lead people in critical moments. And so thinking more intentionally about the way that we communicate in those moments that matter, I think is important to everybody, regardless of where you are in that career progression. And so I think the fundamental components of communicating messages that count in moments that matter is that it's not just emphasizing our message, but it's also putting emphasis on the messenger, which is who am I? I'm interested to see, there's an example that I often use with people. And I say, if I was to show up on your doorstep today, knock on the door and say, hey, do you want to jump in my car and come for a drive? Most people would say, there is no way in the world I'm getting in the car with you. And there's some obvious reasons, but if I was to give you some more context and I said, yeah, but if I told you I'm a really good driver and I've never lost any points off my license, I've never had a speeding fine, I've taken a number of defensive driving courses in my time, I've never been able to be in an accident, and I'm also taking you somewhere that you really want to go, that bit of information isn't really as important if you don't trust me enough to get in the car with me. And so when we talk to people about communicating messages that count in moments that matter, we tend to focus on, but if my message is really good, but if my technique is really good, if I'm just a really good driver, or if I'm taking someone somewhere valuable, they will get in the car with me, and they won't. There is this foundation of trust that is about who you are as an individual. And that is, I think, a critical part in communicating a message that counts.
All right. So now I'm going to ask you the simple, tough question. What is trust? What is trust, for goodness sakes? I mean, I know we could look it up in a dictionary, but I'm looking for not only your interpretation, I'm looking for how people are picking up the cues, how people know, how people come to rely on it, how people assess, is this person more trustworthy or less trustworthy? How does this all factor in?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's lots of different definitions of trust. But I think if I was to boil it down to the summary of most definitions that I've read about trust, I would say that trust is ultimately the consistent alignment between our words and our actions, that allows people to feel that who they're seeing sitting across from us on the other side of the table is the person that we espouse to be. And that means that who we say we are, who we how we act and how we behave is kind of consistently aligned over time, not just in small incremental moments, but is consistently aligned over time.
So I'm going to put us in a situation that would potentially be a trust must or bust, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're going to do. So here I am. I've never met you before, and we're going to go meet and have coffee and have a networking conversation. So help me understand what is going to help me secure trust and what might be erosive to trust outside of some of the obvious things. Because if you're late, I'm sorry, automatically my trust is going to start to wane. But what are some of the other cues that we should be looking for in either direction?
This is fascinating. It's a similar question that was asked of me when someone said, I have to speak in front of an audience, and, you get 30 to 60 seconds to make this first impression. What can I be doing to build trust and credibility in those first few moments of a presentation? And this is going to sound a little bit harsh, but what I would suggest is if you're waiting until that critical moment being you show up to a job interview and you walk into the room, being that you stand on stage and they introduce you and you walk onto the platform, if you're waiting until that moment to ask the question, how do I build trust? You've missed a significant opportunity. And if we were to rewind in this journey of proximity, that is the closest moment to, I guess, a person's interaction with you. But there are all these moments that happen in the lead up to it. So let's go the furthest area or place of proximity away from a person. If I didn't know you, what would be the very first thing that I would do to get to know you? Let's say I've lined up a candidate for an interview, or I'm about to listen to a keynote speaker. What would you do if you wanted to know someone?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I'm a little fearless in this area. I'm like gonna go stalk you. I'm gonna
Yes.
go and find you on LinkedIn. I'm gonna go do a perplexity search and find out all the things that you've said, speeches or podcasts that you've been on. I want to know before I get there, not just if I trust you, but also how I can also give you the spotlight so that you can shine. And I won't know how to do that if I have no information to go on, right? So
Yeah.
yes,
So
I'm
most of
gonna
the
go
time,
online.
what I would say is most people's first step is thinking, well, I'll go online and I'll research someone. I think that's an early step. I would suggest
Yeah.
the very first thing that we do is we ask somebody. We ask somebody who knows this person. So much of our trust is built through other people's relationships. So we engage with people. And this is the thing, like sometimes you will get into a car with a stranger, and you get into the car with a stranger because they have the trust of a brand like Uber. That says this person is someone who is trustworthy. You don't trust the driver, you trust the brand, and therefore you, by association, trust the person. So the first thing to think through is there are people who are talking about you every single day, whether you know it or not. And the question that I would reflect on if you're in this journey of trust would be, what do those people say about me? And I think this is where we talk a lot about network, especially if you're in that stage of looking for a job, or you're building your career, or you're building out your leadership capacity. Your network is important, not just because it provides relational opportunities, but because it also creates advocacy for you as a person within that audience. So I would be asking, who are the people that know me and what would they say about me? I always say, if you want to know what people really think about you, find one of your teammates or one of your people that know you, that maybe they're on their lunch break, or you see them in a shopping center and they haven't yet seen you. Call them and just see what their face does when your number pops up on the screen of their phone. I think you'll learn a lot about how that person feels about you in that moment.
Right. Proof point here is I came to you through somebody that I know, Hannah Pryor, shout out to
Yes.
you. Right. And so there's that. And so I totally skipped that.
There's a
step.
level
So
of
thanks
trust
for
that's
reminding
afforded
me.
to a person because of the relationship of somebody else. And so if it's somebody else that you trust, then you, by association, give this person a degree of trust. So I think it's important, before we jump to the how do I build trust in a conversation, it's like, well, who knows this person and what might they be saying about me? So the simple thing a person can do, I would suggest, think of 3 to 5 of your core network and just ask them, send them a message and say, hey, if you think about me, what are the maybe 3 to 5 words that come up when you think about me? If someone else was to ask you about my positive characteristics, what might you say to those people? And ask, is there a gap between how I would like to be known and how I'm currently known by the people around me? So build out your network, create advocates within your network. And then I think we step into that next stage, which is what you said, which is, what is your online presence look like? And the simplest way, I often say to people, if you're not all over social media, you don't have to be. I would say at bare minimum, be on LinkedIn. And there's a reason why I say be on LinkedIn. It's because LinkedIn's the oldest social media platform and the most search engine optimized, which means if you were to put your name into Google, there's a good chance LinkedIn is the first platform that would come up. So even if you don't post every single day or even every single week or month on LinkedIn, you don't have to do that. But what I would say is have a profile that is up to date, that has a current photo, that has a bio and a career map that is actually relevant, that you would want people to find, because it's most likely the first thing that people are going to find about you. But ultimately ask the question, where am I showing up and how do I create visibility and presence in those locations?
I think those are all, and I'm so glad that you mentioned the who you know and who can advocate for you, because naturally this is the power of referrals, right? And
Yes.
referrals can surpass a lot of activity that shows up in what other people and myself included call the black holes, right? There's no trust in an applicant tracking system.
Yeah.
It's just a bunch of keywords and algorithms that are mixed together. And if you are a leader, chances are somebody wants to know, like, where'd you come from? What'd you do? And
Yeah.
all that good stuff that is
And who can
only
I
gonna
talk
happen
to that
by
might be able to give me
who
some
can I talk
insight about that? I was on a podcast earlier today and we were having this conversation about leaving an organization and the importance of leaving an organization well. And the reason, one of the big reasons why you should leave an organization well is because you never know how important those people become as advocates for your next role or a future role. When you see an organization go through significant change, a CEO might come in, but the CEO typically brings in a leadership team. And when you look at the leadership team of that CEO, they tend to follow them around to different organizations because they've built that trust over time. So
Mhm.
they are people who are advocates of that person, who know that person, they've developed trust over time with that person. So it's really important to be thinking about who are those people. If I was to travel around to multiple different jobs, who would I take with me or who would take me with them? And I think it's a really good question to reflect on.
It sure is. I had a former client, just call him Joey, and he told me that in his next job, he's going to bring the team with him, and that would be his fifth iteration of bringing the same team from place to place to place to place. That's huge. I mean, one, I can understand. Two, that's exceptional.
That's the
Five,
currency of
that's
trust, though, right? That I think that is the value of trust. When you've built those trusting relationships, Stephen Covey talks about it, the speed of trust. Your ability to go into an organization or tackle a project with people that have that high degree of trust means you move quicker. There's high value of those relationships. So we can't underestimate the important role that trust plays in career progression and leadership influence.
yeah. So that begs the question, like, how long does it take? I mean, how long does it take to build the trust bank? Is it something that you can just, I run into the executives all the time. They're like, I've been trying to network with this person for a long time and they're not getting back to me. And, sometimes it can take a long time. Sometimes it doesn't. So how do you assess whether, hey, this is something that I'm in the process of building, or this is just never going to happen. This person, for whatever reasons, maybe it's trust, maybe it's something else, is time to move on.
Oh, it's such a hard question. It's a little bit like
I know.
credibility, isn't it? It's not built
Right.
overnight, it's built over time. And I think trust is the same. There was a study done back in 2021 by, I think, the Workforce Institute, and they studied 4,000 people
Mm-hmm.
and they asked the question, do you trust people on day one when it comes to someone starting in a new role? And only 1 in 4 leaders said that people are given trust on day one. So essentially, very, very few people will give you trust. Trust is something that many people believe has to be earned. And I think they found nearly 65% of people said that trust had to be earned, which I feel like is really sad. I definitely think there's also a cultural shift in this. So I was obviously, I spent most of my life in Australia, and I think in Australia we typically give people a degree of trust until that trust is broken, in which case we tend to remove elements of trust. But I remember moving to the UK, and I now live in London. And I remember meeting some people who were Americans, and they were on the tube with us. And we struck up a conversation. We got chatting. We became friends. And people said to us, "How did you meet?" And we said, "Oh, we met each other on the tube." And they said, "What do you mean?" We're like, "Oh, we just struck up a conversation. We got talking." I remember this one girl said to me, she said, "Shane, what do you mean you spoke to a stranger on the tube? Like, I live down the road from a prison. How do you know that person on the tube just didn't escape from the prison?" And I thought to myself, I love that your immediate assumption is that the person sitting next to me on the tube is possibly not a friendly person, but most likely an escaped convict. Because in the UK, there was this element of trust is not given, it's earned. So I think this also has some cultural implications based on where you are in the world. But trust is essentially a process of deposits and withdrawals. And I think we start very neutrally depending on where you are in the world. Some you have maybe a little bit of balance in the account, but every interaction with a person, every positive interaction is making a deposit in that trust bank. Every negative interaction is making a withdrawal. And unfortunately, the withdrawals tend to come out at a much higher value than the deposits. So we can build trust over time with maybe $1 a day, but we can do one thing that might withdraw $10 at a time. So we have to be really conscious about that.
So in this process, right? In this process of people going through job interviews and networking conversations, what are the signals what are the signals that turn the green light on, turn the red light, flashing and blinking? What are those things that we should know about and look out for?
Yeah, great question. One of the things that, again, in this Trust in the Modern Workplace study, they looked at what were the things that helped build trust in leadership and in organizations, and what were the things that essentially were the green lights that people were looking for. Interestingly enough, most people would assume that the things that are going to build trust for a person are those very human, in quote, moments. When you tell stories and, you're being a bit more vulnerable with a person. Interestingly enough, that wasn't the thing that built trust most effectively. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't build trust. I'm still an advocate for storytelling and vulnerability, absolutely. But the things that really strengthened trust were these things. Number one, it was that you were dependable, which means that you could be relied on. Number two, it was that you were honest, which meant there was alignment between your words and your actions. Number three, you actively listened. So the way you listened in a conversation was ultimately building trust. You gave helpful feedback, which is quite confronting because we tend to not like either receiving feedback or giving feedback. We were modeling behaviors, or what they called leading by example, and that they genuinely cared about employee well-being, or we genuinely cared about people. So most of the time people think, oh, I need to be really vulnerable, I need to tell stories. And really what I would say is follow through on your commitments, say what you mean, listen more than you speak, make time for important conversations, model what you talk about, and check in with people. These are all really simple things that you can do. So if you're in a conversation, even in an interview, the simplest thing you can do is going to help build trust is learn how to actively listen. Learn how to listen to what's being said, paraphrase and reflect back to the interviewer, and you'll be surprised how quickly you can accelerate that journey towards trust.
Mm-hmm. I love this because I find that the simplest things, people are like, I've heard that before. Well, guess what? It's not about whether you heard it. It's about how you're implementing it. Because I don't know how many times, and I know this through clients, I know this through myself, I'll follow up on such and such. I'll send you this book. I'll introduce you to this person, right? Every time you do that, cha-ching, right? You're getting like extra trust, equity.
Yes.
When you don't do it, it can't help but put that seed in our heads. I actually have this example that I kind of go back to over and over again. And it harkens to the times that we've all bought gifts for somebody. Maybe it was a baby shower or it was a wedding gift. And you think to yourself years later, never even heard from this person. Did they get my onesie that I sent? Or did, like somehow this happened. And even though you may not necessarily be counting, it puts that little seed of doubt, like, They just totally miss that. And I think that this happens on such a nuanced and maybe subconscious level when we are especially in a very heightened state where we're expecting something back, right? We want somebody to go introduce us. And then of course it's like, oh yeah, we got to like look at ourselves. Are we doing what we want other people to do? And that is where I think you mentioned that, leading by example.
Even that idea of the challenge around what do we do when trust is fractured or broken, I think plays just as important a role as how do we build trust in the process. I have a good friend, his name is Rowan Dredge, and he talks a lot about trust. And one of the things he said to me that's always stuck with me is that it's important that when trust is broken, we rebuild trust in the same context in which it was broken. And I'll give you a good example of this. I often see, let's say you show up to work one day, and you're in a team meeting, you haven't had your coffee, you had a bad night's sleep, you're just feeling irritated and agitated, and your patience is lower than it should be. You go into a meeting, someone suggests something that grates on you, and you just snap at them and you get angry at them, and everybody in the room watches you kind of tear this person down in a non-helpful way. What would typically happen is you would leave that meeting, you'd have your coffee, you'd have, a break, get some fresh air, and you go, that was not okay. That was not the right behavior. That was not how I want to be known. So what do? You go straight to that person, you sit down with them and you say, hey, I just wanted to apologize for the way I behaved in that meeting. That was not okay. And most of the time that person will say, oh, I get it. You were having a bad day. I feel perfectly okay with this. And what we forget is that one person that we built the relationship with and restored that trust with, there are still 8 more people who were in the room who didn't see that reconciliation conversation. And so 8 other people have almost perceived you in a particular way that is not how you would like to be known, and you fractured trust with those 8 people. So what I always say to the leaders I work with is, if you have one of those moments, the best thing you can do is the next team meeting, you go back to that same context and you say, hey, everyone, I wanted to let you know we've had this private conversation, but I also want to make sure that I apologize to you publicly and let you know that's not how I would like to be known, nor what I believe is appropriate behavior. And that ability to recognize and be humble in that same context actually goes a long way in rebuilding some of the trust that you've
Mm.
lost in that moment.
Well, it just happens to be a very timely reminder, because I need to do that, and it is uncomfortable. As you were
It's very
describing it, I was
uncomfortable.
like, but that is what leadership is. It's certainly not comfortable, and if you are going to establish the trust, you got to swallow the pill sometimes too.
Exactly. And even sometimes, like, let's say you're looking to interview for a job and you've had a recruiter reach out to you and you said that you would deliver something to them by a certain time and that you don't do that, that immediately is going to fracture that trust. And so, again, these simple things that you can do, that we've made a withdrawal on our trust currency, and therefore picking up the phone and letting that person know, saying, hey, I'm really sorry I missed that deadline. I want to let you know that's not how I want to be known, nor is it as a consistent behavior of mine. And I wanted to apologize. And here's what I'm going to do in future to change that. And then following through and backing up that apology with action can actually go a long way in rebuilding some of that broken trust.
So what you're getting at, even though the conversation is about trust, is in order to get to trust, sometimes you need a lot of humility, right? Like crow tastes a lot better when it's served warm. And so you might want to have some, spare, and be able to put your ego aside for the betterment of that team, maybe even that interview, maybe even, that thing that you forgot to do, and in the spirit of a good chef, right? Clean up as you go.
Yeah.
So that you don't turn around and all of a sudden find a huge mess behind you.
Yeah. Well, we talked about, a friend of mine and I were having this conversation today about, some of the hard-hitting career truths. And one of her hard-hitting career truths was to not have a policy, having a no excuse policy, where we tend to make excuses and kind of try to shift blame in certain things. And one of the things I said to her is that the word excuse is actually made up of 2 origin words, which is to be out or free from, and the second part is about blame. And when we make an excuse, the whole goal is to be out or free from blame. And when we try to shift blame, it removes the ability to take responsibility. And when we don't take responsibility, we do fracture trust with people. So even simple things, not only just following through on your commitments, saying what you mean, active listening, making sure that when we do get it wrong, we're not just trying to shift blame or make excuses, but being humble, putting our ego to the side, taking responsibility. All those things actually help enhance trust, even though they were bad circumstances. So just because it was a bad circumstance doesn't mean we can't use that to still maintain and build trust in the process.
Yeah, and I want to just add here, because, like I said, I'm just in the middle of this, and I had to make an apology and made no excuses for it last Friday, and I am still unclear whether the outcome is going to turn into some kind of rectifying result. I don't know, and I think that my peace, like the peace, is that I have no expectations on what's going to happen. I really don't. I just want to make sure that what I said was heard, and it was.
And well done for taking the responsibility for that. Because I think when it comes to rebuilding some of that trust in those conversations, we actually don't get to determine whether or not people trust us.
Right.
All we can do is take responsibility for our actions and our conversations and our behaviors. And in hope that with the consistency over time, people would start to rebuild those, like bricks in a wall. We put a brick in at a time, and hopefully over time we build something which is substantial and sustainable.
This is kind of a little bit of a cross section of a couple of important questions as it relates to folks when they are in the interview process, they're executives, they clearly want to establish some trust. And in those initial conversations, right? And when they're working to do that, oftentimes I get the question, should I be answering in the I first person, or how am I going to impart that I'm a leader and take full credit versus the we of our team? How do I walk away with, the accolades or the alignment that says, hey, I can lead, while I'm also, being a quote unquote great team leader? How does that, where are the lanes here?
Yeah, it's a really delicate tension to manage. I think one of my favorite quotes is this a problem to solve, or is this a tension to manage? And I think this seems to me like one of those tensions to manage, because being able to get into an interview and go, do I always use the I context, or do I use the we context? There is no right or wrong in that space, but knowing how do I manage the tension of not being overly focused on me whilst not neglecting me in the process. And I think part of that really comes through in the stories we tell, and looking at the roles that we play in certain stories. And so we can tell a story that allows everyone in the story to feel like a hero, but also positions you as the leader in that conversation as well. So I don't know that there is a hard and fast rule on I versus we, but I would be ask myself the question, am I being pulled in one direction too much? So am I noticing that in this conversation, I'm using I a lot, and I'm putting a lot of the emphasis on me without that recognition of the team's work? Or am I doing too much of the other way? Am I saying we to everything, and am I missing the chance to really position the role that I played within that? And so almost pulling ourselves back into the middle and allowing ourselves to have both of those in the conversation.
I'm going to take this conversation into another area that I know you have a lot of depth of knowledge, and a lot of our clients are, or folks who are listening are, they're at the executive level. So chances are they're probably, in their late 30s, mid 40s, over 40, 50s, 60s, like me. And so my question is, in this world of intergenerational workforces, how do some of us who are in the boomer era, how do we establish trust with some of the folks in the work world that we may not necessarily understand? What can we do that immediately allows for some kind of cohesion versus division?
Oh, I like this question, because I think everyone's been asking this question as each new generation emerges in the workforce. We sit there and go, please help me make sense of these people. And I think especially as we're seeing a lot of generational changes around expectations from Gen Z, it brings another kind of, the importance of this question comes up a lot more. I think as leaders and as human beings, we carry around what I call our invisible rule book. And the invisible rule book is made up with a whole set of expectations that we have of the people around us. And they typically involve three sets of expectations: an expectation of self, an expectation of others, and an expectation of the world in general. So for example, I have expectations of me as an individual. How should I perform? What should I be doing? Where should I be at my career? Should I own a house? Should I have kids? All these self-imposed expectations. I have expectations of you. So how should we do conflict? What should you do if you have an issue with me? Do you come directly to me? Do you talk to somebody else about me? And we have expectations of the world in general. So the world should be generally a kind and empathetic or compassionate place, but we know that's not always the case. The problem is other people can't see your rule book, and we use that rule book to usually judge the people around us. We judge generations by it. We judge people by it. And one of my favorite quotes is from a New York therapist. Her name's Toria Leto, and she said, "What isn't communicated is felt. What's felt is interpreted, and what's interpreted is often inaccurate." And I really think one of the best things we can do if we want to work either through intergenerational workforces or even just build better collaborative team environments is to ask this question. And it's one simple question you can ask, which is, what do we expect of one another here? What do we expect? What is in your rule book? What's in your rule book that I can't see? And how do we make the unspoken spoken? The moment we make the unspoken spoken, we start to ask ourselves the question, is this a helpful expectation to hold, or is this an unhelpful expectation to hold? And if it's unhelpful, we can start to reframe it. And if it is helpful, we now make it explicit. A really good example of this is I was talking to a team member once, and I said, what do you expect of people? And she said, well, I think that if someone's going to the morning tea room to make themselves a cup of tea, they should also make me one when they go and bring it back out. And I said to her, what is that about for you? And she said, Shane, I just think it's about good collaboration. I was like, I've never heard that before, but I imagined what was taking place is a person's going to make themselves a cup of tea and they walk back past the reception desk and they just look at the receptionist just scowling with this angry look on her face, so frustrated because she hadn't made tea. But she's never told anyone on the team that before. And I said, if you just made that explicit, you would probably realize that's not a helpful expectation to hold, and you could start to reframe that. But apply that conversation to every set of expectations, not just of people in the same generation, but multi-generational. If you want to know what Gen Z want, ask them. If you want to know how boomers like to be led, ask them. Make those unspoken expectations explicit.
Oh, thank you for that. Because as you were telling the story, when you were telling us about the tea woman, I was thinking that's called room service. And that was her expectation. That's brilliant. I want to thank you for getting so much clarity in these conversations to help us all with trust. We are in a very uncertain time here, maybe not as much in the UK, but definitely here in the US. And I know that there's a lot of tension between whether it's the end of the year and people and their uncertainty now. Maybe it's, depending on what's happened by virtue of the election. Maybe it's just the climate of you and feeling uncertain with respect to, your age in the job market. There's just a lot of messages that are swarming. If you're going into the holiday season and you are going to have some of these crucial conversations, how can you, as either a leader, a human, a colleague, somebody, what are some of the things you're not going to ask the expectation questions at a holiday party, but are there any things that you can do to insert or plant seeds of trust during those times, knowing this environment is what it is?
Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge I'm sending so much, thoughts and I guess mindfulness to you and the people who are listening who are in the States right now, who are dealing with so much complexity and so much uncertainty and potentially a lot of hurt or fractured trust. And so I want to just acknowledge that what people are experiencing, everyone responds to fractured trust in very different ways, and that's okay. I know this seems very, very maybe obvious, but maybe not. There's one of my favorite quotes, I think is Stephen Covey said this as well, which is seek first to understand, then to be understood. And I think when you're in those contexts where there's potentially conflicting values, beliefs, opinions, or when there is uncertainty or fractured trust, we often want to do everything we can to make sure people understand us. And we want to get our point of view across, or we want to feel heard and we want to feel seen and valued and appreciated. But one of the best things we can do is to allow another person to feel seen, heard, and understood, and really seek to understand the position that they're in before trying to push ourselves onto them and try to get them to understand us. I think if we all go into the holiday season with that desire to want to be a little bit more understanding, that seeking to understand a little bit more, to be a little more curious and a little less judgmental, I think it can go a long way in helping people feel seen, heard, valued, and appreciated.
And thank you for doing that for all of us today. Shane Hatton, I am so grateful to you. And thank you, listeners. Thank you for being here. Thank you for trusting us with this time. And also, if you liked this episode, we will ask you, please write us an Apple review or Spotify review. This is how we grow. And this is also how we're able to maintain our 1% podcast ranking. And it's very important to us because truthfully, we're not here to, make $1 million or anything like that. This podcast is for you. And it's also to help you win in wherever you are in your career, whether it's a job search or you're in a leadership position. We will also include links to Shane's book down below. So make sure you check those out, and also his website so you can hire him as a keynote speaker. All right. Thank you again, Shane. And I really, really am thrilled that our paths crossed, and more good things coming your way.
Likewise, it's been such a privilege to be a part of the podcast. I feel like we could have this conversation all day, so we can end the recording, but let's just keep talking for the next few hours.
I'm so good with that. I'm so good. Should we order tea?
It sounds perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining today. We appreciate your listening ears. Big time. We ask this: use these tools, not tomorrow, right now, and share them by spreading the love, leaving us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss the next career blast and a half. Most of all, thank you for you.